Hello, and welcome to Pride, Love is Love. My name is George Sylvia, and I'll be your presenter on this presentation about pride and the history of the LGBTQ community. Before we begin, I feel like it's important to note that as with any topic, this is one which people have vastly differing opinions, and that's okay. What we're looking to do here is foster a better understanding of each other through discussion of this topic. What we want to do is remain respectful in sharing our opinions and also respectful of others' opinions, right? And acknowledging that there's a difference between understanding something and accepting it, right? So we don't necessarily have to understand something in order to accept it. But we really want to come away understanding better the differences of human emotion and the beauty that we are, right? The diversity that we have, because there's something really special in this world. And regardless of our opinions, we can all agree that, life is such a gift. So I just want to thank everyone for remaining respectful and also sharing your opinions and having these really tough but also really great conversations. So throughout this presentation, we're going to discuss a few key things, right? We're going to look at pride through the lens of the community. So who is the community? We're going to discuss that. What is pride itself, right? LGBTQ plus history, so the history of the community that we're talking about. And then why does the United States celebrate pride? And it's kind of the goal here that after listening to this discussion and thinking about your own thoughts, your own feelings, right, you're going to be able to kind of ask yourself these questions of what does pride mean to you and why is it important to you? Why should you care about pride, right? These are all really personal questions that I hope we can all come up with our own answers to by the end of this. So what does the acronym LGBTQ plus mean, right? So that acronym is going to describe to us a little bit about what the community entails. So we're going to go through, and I thought it'd be fun maybe to look at some famous people and see where they fall under these categories so that we can sort of put a face to the name, so to speak. So if we're looking up at the top, the woman in black, that there, see if you know her, might be Lily Tomlin. So Lily Tomlin is a longtime comedian and more recently very well known for her role in the show Grace and Frankie. So that's her and her wife. On the other side on the top there, you can see this man and his husband, if anybody knows. That's George Takei. So he would be the G in that LGBT, so gay, and that just means that he's attracted to other men. He's most well known for his role in Star Trek. Now on the bottom, the woman in red, she would be that B in the community. And so that right there is Drew Barrymore. She's been in more movies than I can remember, but you might know her as the little girl from E.T. She is an out bisexual woman, and what that means is that she's attracted to both males and females. And then on the opposite side of her, that there is Laverne Cox. She is an actress that is known for both her role in Orange is the New Black, which is a fairly recent TV show, but also as a trans rights activist. And that's because Laverne Cox was biologically born a male, but feels like a female, and so wants her sort of life to be portrayed as such. Going along with that, Christine Jorgensen, who's the woman in the middle of the picture there, this is a person who is known as the first person to undergo gender reassignment surgery. And so what that is that Christine Jorgensen was born biologically male, served in the U.S. Army after high school, serving in World War II, and then after being discharged and going to college and learning about gender reassignment surgery, Christine flew over to Europe into Copenhagen, where she was able to actually get gender reassignment surgery and be one of the first people to have gender-affirming surgery. What that is basically someone who is transgender who is seeking that surgery so that their sexual gender can also reflect how they feel inside. And then adding on Q plus. So what does that mean? Q means questioning, and what that means is someone who is questioning their sexual orientation or their gender. And so it's kind of a blanket term that describes many different people in the community. And it's a newer term that is still kind of forming. And then the plus. So what the plus really stands for is that this is a community that's really solely based on inclusivity. And so it's a community that is affirmation of self-love and really just stands for the fact that all humans deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. And so there are many people that fall under these, communities that all are kind of lumped into this one name. So from here on out, I'll be kind of referring to it as the LGBTQ plus community. And so, that's a little bit about what we mean there. So now that we've talked about the acronym and what the community actually is and what it entails, we're going to be talking about what Pride is, right? So what is Pride? Pride basically started in 1969 after what was known as the Stonewall Inn riots in New York. And originally it was, one part protest, one part celebration. That really was seen to build on, social gains of people sort of starting to accept LGBTQ community in the United States. So this started first in Chicago, New York, San Francisco, and Los Angeles, but quickly grew from there. As you can see in some of these pictures, Pride is, again, part like a march, looking to gain sort of political right and social acceptance, but also really it feels like a festival. It's a celebration. People are going there to feel accepted and sort of fight stigmatism, right, against homosexuality in general. But then also, it's a time where people get together and oppose that shame, right? That social stigma, and really be the opposite of that. So it stands for love, and just like it says, it stands for pride, being proud of who we are as individuals, as people who are unique and deserve that respect. So now that we've talked a little bit about pride, we know a little bit about that, but obviously there was an LGBTQ plus community before Pride, as it's a more modern invention, right? And so let's talk a little bit about what LGBTQ plus community looked like throughout history, because it definitely changed a lot. So while the LGBTQ rights movement that we know today really started around 1969, 1970, this is a group that has been around for as long as there have been humans. Ideas about what it meant to be in that community have changed throughout time, and in ways that might surprise us. So for instance, in 27 BC, which is the first year of the Roman Empire under Emperor Augustus, this, of course, is quite a long time ago. What we do know, though, from several different writings and artwork is that much like ancient Greece before it, homosexuality was not necessarily stigmatized as it is in the modern Western society today. We do know that same-sex marriages did take place, and in fact, 27 BC is the first recorded example of a same-sex marriage that we know took place. So this is a really cool example of, if we look 2,000 years ago, more than 2,000 years ago, same-sex couples were getting married and living life. The difference, too, is if we're looking at sort of the way that relationships work, our modern idea of relationships is heavily based around gender, so the male and female sort of binary. But what we do know about both ancient Greece and early Rome is that their idea of sexuality and relationships in general was much less focused on gender and much more focused on gender roles. So that can sound a little bit confusing, but what it basically boils down to is that there was still stigma in some circumstances, right? But it all depend on your image, right? And so if you were a male in ancient Rome who was attracted to other men, it wouldn't be considered stigmatizing. But if you were a male who was considered to be more feminine, that could be stigmatizing. So unfortunately, they still have a long way to go. But it is important to note that their view of sexuality not being based on gender had a large way and impact in how they thought about it. So that's really something that maybe we should think about too, knowing that it wasn't all perfect in ancient Rome, but saying, do our societal opinions and views about gender and its importance in sex, do those have an impact on how we view this community? So moving from ancient Rome, and throughout the entire period of the Roman rule, all the way up until the 400 CE timeline, there was homosexuality, and it was legal, and it was fairly common, comparatively. Right around 1512, the early medieval period, we start to see homophobia and anti-gay laws start popping up throughout Europe. But again, it's really a Western-centric thing. So in places like China, India, Japan, all over the world, homophobia was not necessarily a big thing at this point. So as the Catholic Church started to really increase its influence all throughout Europe, different laws, often known as anti-sodomy laws, were being put in place to persecute anyone who um, was found to be in an open, same-sex relationship. So in 1512, there's a really important example of this coming from Florence, Italy. So if we know anything about Florence, the ruling family of the time had been the Medici family, a very powerful and very wealthy mercantile family. And Italy, as it was broken up into a bunch of small states at this time, was really ruled by their mercantile elites. So these very, very wealthy families who had a hereditary hold on the society. Aristocrats, so the children of these very powerful people, were also known to have, various same-sex relationships as a fairly common thing, and it was allowed up until this point. Anti-sodomy laws were passed around 1498, and they were very strict, with penalties ranging from fines to barring from running for political office, all the way to exile and death even. And so for years, this sort of went on with people being persecuted, entire noble families being really slandered. And unfortunately, almost like the witch trials, this persecution of saying that someone was guilty of sodomy could really destroy a family's reputation, even if it was completely unfounded. Not that that makes it, one way or the other okay. And so in 1512, it's actually recorded that this wealthy family sort of had a gathering where 30 young gay males of aristocratic status, so wealthy males, got together, led by one male whose family had been pretty well ruined by, allegations of sodomy. They armed themselves and they covered themselves in symbols of the Medici family. So we may have seen it's a it's a diamond ring sort of crest, and they armed themselves with stilettos and clubs, and they actually stormed the council, the town council at the time, and demanded that these laws be revoked and that all of the people that were charged with these things be, found innocent and allowed to return if they had been exiled. Given little choice, the governor at the time did in fact, follow through with some of their demands, and the laws were overruled. It wasn't perfect, but it did make some level of freedom for the gay community in Florence for a short period. Then, a little bit later on, a whole new regime would come in, and unfortunately, they would lose much of the rights that were gained. But it's interesting because historians really look at this as the first example of the gay rights movement. About 500 years ago today, these people are saying, enough is enough. We're going to stand up and really, protect ourselves and defend our community. So I just think that, in a world where we can often think very time-centric of, this is where things are happening today, things have been happening, right? And so as we look and see this next event, which is going to be our Stonewall riots, it's important to note that history is very long and that there has been a struggle much longer than just our current time. But in 1969 and throughout the 50s and 60s, sort of gay life in the country, really, the whole community, was kind of evolving. Gay bars were popping up in many places, including New York, which is where the Stonewall Inn was located. But because there was sort of a legal gray area in a lot of places, these bars oftentimes fell to mafia ownership. And what that actually meant was that a lot of the patrons, especially the wealthier ones, would have to pay blackmail fees to the owners of the establishment, and then the owners would pay police blackmail fees to keep them from raiding the buildings. Because unfortunately, in many places like New York, it was illegal to openly serve alcohol to openly gay people. And you could be raided and arrested for many different things. And so, for instance, during the Stonewall riot, police raided. They weren't prepared for it because they hadn't been tipped off, which is ironically one of the things that the establishment owners were most upset about. And what happened is that they lined up the patrons. There were about 200, mostly gay, but some lesbian and some transgender people involved, right? And so they were lined up and sort of brought outside. Many of them were released, but importantly, if it was a male, they had to be wearing what was called gender appropriate clothing, so male clothing covering most of the body. And if it was a female, they had to have at least 3 articles of gender appropriate clothing on their body, or they could be arrested. And if it was a male that was dressed as a woman, they would be arrested immediately, regardless of their own personal feelings, unfortunately. And so this was an incredibly, painful event, you can imagine. Police officers were taking people into the bathroom to check their genders. Eyewitnesses say that there were, people in handcuffs being beaten with clubs. And so very quickly, at 1 in the morning, a crowd started forming outside of the Stonewall Inn. And it said that this transgender woman was being brought out in handcuffs and was being beaten with a billy club. And the crowd sort of very quickly became a mob. And people were ironically saying that the police had raided because there hadn't been a fee that was paid, this bribery fee. And so it said that the crowd quickly started throwing change at the police and chanting that, well, we should really give them the money if that's what they're looking for. But unfortunately, bottles quickly began being thrown, and what followed was a few days of riots of about 500 people. So some estimates go all the way up to 1,000. Unfortunately, this didn't necessarily change immediately, at least, the laws. But what this is seen as doing is really bringing to the forefront of many Americans that, this was a struggle that was going on. I think, again, before it's known, before we talk about it, it can be very hard to sympathize with a group that you don't even know really what they're about or what they're going through. And so after this, the community started to really pick up steam, and the same-sex rights kind of movement started to really become quite important. So with that, 3 months about after the Stonewall riots, there were about 3 new newspapers that were formed just in those 3 months to support the gay rights movement. And then 1 year later, that was when we had the first Pride event that was supposed to be both remembering and also sort of capitalizing on the political gains that were made throughout that year and looking to build a bridge to gain, acceptance in society. So it was around this time that we see Harvey Milk. So Harvey Milk is a Californian. He had moved to California to start a camera business, actually. But in the 1970s, he had moved to the Castro district, which is a known gay community in San Francisco, and was actually quickly moved by the political movements there to run for office as an openly gay individual. He suffered setbacks at first, kind of bumping up against the existing gay political movement in the area. But his campaign was boisterous. It was new. It was a little bit different than what was seen as originally sort of a more straight, friendly campaign that tried to remain a little bit under the radar. And so, while he wasn't necessarily popular with the existing political establishment, he found that he was quite popular with the gay community in the area. And he lost that election, but it was enough to kind of show him that he should continue looking to run for office and really represent the community. So he would try again, and then in 1977, he would be elected as one of San Francisco's Board of Supervisors. So he was the first openly gay man elected in California, and in his time in office, sponsored a bill which tried to ban discrimination against LGBTQ individuals or anyone based on their sexual preference. Unfortunately, that same year, Harvey Milk would be assassinated by another former board member, Dan White, who was also the only person who voted against the bill to ban discrimination based on sexual preference. So, Harvey Milk was really known as someone who supported the community in this sort of early stage of political movement, and also a tragic loss for all America. So from 1977, we look forward to 2003, and this is a really landmark case. So in 2003, there were these 2 men named John Lawrence and Tyrone Garner. They were arrested and charged under Texas's sodomy law, and they tried to appeal their case. And the court there first initially found that the sodomy law in Texas was unconstitutional, but then the state of Texas appealed the ruling and had them rehear it. And upon rehearing it, they sort of repealed their earlier decision and upheld the law as constitutional. And so the two defendants then went to the state's criminal appeals court and were denied a hearing. So finally, they elevated it to the United States Supreme Court. And so this was a huge case because in this landmark decision, the Supreme Court did in fact rule that this Texas law was unconstitutional. And in doing so, it actually invalidated 13 other state sodomy laws and legalized same-sex relations in the entire United States, all with one brushstroke. So this was a huge moment for the community, and we saw a lot of sort of political action moving towards change at this time. That takes us to our sixth event, and that's in 2004, when the Massachusetts Supreme Court ruled that it was unconstitutional to allow only same-sex couples to marry. This made Massachusetts the first state in the country to legalize same-sex marriage, but actually the sixth jurisdiction in the entire world to legalize gay marriage. So really, marriage equality had been a long and hard struggle for many people, and this was a very early victory. After this, though, we saw that several states that had large populations that opposed this movement started placing laws that were even more restrictive than previous laws in their state statutes and also their constitutions. Some of these laws, for instance, would put in a constitution that a state's idea of marriage was between a man and a woman. So we did see some pushback, but that was a small minority. And what we really began to see is that the vast majority of Americans supported marriage equality for one reason or another. And so things started to build. And by 2014, 70% of the U.S. population was living in jurisdictions that had legalized same-sex marriage. So that was a huge jump, obviously, and we can see that public sentiment was really building to gain marriage equality as a federal right as well. And finally, on June 26, 2015, in Ogdenville v. Hodges, the Supreme Court ruled that same-sex marriage was legal federally across the entire 50 states. So in this one broad brushstroke, really, the marriage equality push in the United States really saw their biggest achievement yet, which was gaining that marriage equality. It was a huge achievement for many people, and you can imagine, if you were someone that was waiting for this to happen to allow you to be married, or had someone that you loved that was waiting, this was an amazing moment for people and really had a magical feel to it for many. Of course, there's still a long way to go in a lot of different aspects. And both within and without the community, people are still kind of thinking about where to go next and what is important, right? And so we've got a lot of progress to be made, but this was definitely a landmark that many people saw as the pinnacle of what we were looking to do. Now that we've looked at some of the important events throughout the LGBTQ plus community and their history, I thought it would be important to now look at sort of the cultural and social impact of this community in general. It is important to note, though, that our gender identity and sexual preference are just two factors of what make up the whole, right? And everybody's unique and everybody's beautiful and different. And so every member of this community is a human being, right? So we're all, I think, more similar than we are different. So tea dances started in the 1960s in New York, and they originally were a nod to the earlier 17th and 18th century English, parties where gentlemen would have their friends in their big houses over, and they would kind of have a tea party. But what this was is that in New York at the time, and many other places throughout the country, it was illegal to serve an openly homosexual person alcohol. And so, unfortunately, that kind of barred them out of the bars, right, as we saw in the Stonewall riots. And so what people started to do was they said, well, if we can't safely go to a club, we can't go to a bar, but we still want to have social interaction, right? They started holding these tea dances on Sunday afternoons on these islands throughout New York. And what they were is they'd get together, they would serve tea, people would dance, they would have fun, they would talk, and it was just a regular party, sans alcohol, right? And so those continued from the 60s, and you'll see there's two women dancing there at an early tea dance. And then right below them is a 1970s tea dance. And then if you look at this picture right here, this is taken in Provincetown, Massachusetts. And this is a modern tea dance taken sometime around 2019. And so tea dances have definitely continued up through the modern time. The alcohol is back, but besides that, they're very similar, and it's just a celebration of human life. In terms of societal impact, I thought it would be interesting to look at three different individuals that were members of the LGBTQ plus community that have made a huge impact on us today. So our first one here is Sarah Josephine Barker. She is important for a couple different reasons. One of them, the first woman to receive a doctorate, so she was a physician, and also the first woman to be selected to represent in the League of Nations. She's also the first person to really identify what is known today as Typhoid Mary, and is really, really valuable in looking at things like infant mortality rate in the United States, and work on ways to improve health in hospitals. We talked a little bit about Harvey Milk, the first openly gay American politician. We know that he passed those laws that really were looking to ban discrimination, which is widely important, and is seen as this pillar of the community that unfortunately was snuffed out too soon. And then on the far side, we've got John Sonnabend. So Sonnabend was a gay man from South Africa who came to Greenwich Village and really was looking to work on the AIDS epidemic as it started, right? And so what he did was he opened community clinics, provided healthcare to people who couldn't otherwise afford many of the options, and worked to really raise awareness. And so with talking about that, it is important to mention AIDS, because I think many people know AIDS as sort of a gay disease. And that's not the case, right? There's no such thing as a gay disease, as we've said. Gay people are simply people who are gay, but they're people nonetheless. And so, AIDS really started out, and it was originally known as GRIDS, which is the gay-related immunodeficiency disorder. And because of that, many historians and epidemiologists say that the federal government really failed to act as quickly as they should have because it was seen as a gay disease, and so not as much of a threat to the rest of society, and potentially not something to be worried about, right? And unfortunately, it was devastating to the gay community. And so it was really up to that community to sort of start to, fight back for themselves and protect themselves. And so people like Joseph Sonnabend, are really important in doing things like that and providing health care to a community that was often underserved and, underprotected. So I thought it would be interesting to look at three different sort of artists in the LGBTQ plus community in different media. The first one is Frida Kahlo, and you can see her up there in her self-portrait of this picture titled Roots. Frida Kahlo is a Mexican painter who's known for very famously taking the Mexican landscape and using it as inspiration in her work, and also being an early pioneer of sort of gender identity, discussions and politics in that area. Next, of course, everybody knows Sir Elton John, very famous musician, right? One of the most famous musicians of all time, and so a member of the LGBTQ plus community. I'm sure everybody knows him and his work. And then finally, of course, the works of Leonardo da Vinci. Da Vinci is an interesting one, and one which, of course, is a historic, person. But many historians do agree that Leonardo da Vinci was, if not, solely homosexual, definitely sexually open. And it has been written from both himself in self-written letters that he did have male relationships. He's most well known probably for painting the Mona Lisa, which is possibly the most famous painting of all time, and was recently in the news. So I guess Da Vinci can be proud of that, but also painting works like, say, The Last Supper. So that really famous, one of the most famous depictions of Christian gospel sort of painted by this man who is a member of this community. Now, there are many other LGBTQ plus authors, writers, singers, many of whom we would probably be surprised to find out. And I think that only adds credence to the fact that this community is one which is different in very minor ways and mostly similar to everybody else. So I thought we could end off with a little bit of interesting facts. So some facts to be proud of, right? So the flag that you see here, which is a classic, pride flag. There's some newer iterations you may see that have a chevron that are meant to include some different groups, right? So this original rainbow flag was designed in 1978 by Gilbert Barker and has really been one of the most popular symbols of the LGBTQ plus community. So it's quite popular. President Obama announced the designation of the first national monument to the LGBTQ rights in 2016, which is fairly recent for this. And then these two down the bottom I find to be eye-opening, right? More than 2.4 Americans 65 and older identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. And then in total, more than 20 million Americans identify in this community. It's important to note that, of course, we've made a lot of progress, but it is still something which is very difficult for people and very personal, the decision to be open about their gender, sexual preferences, right? And so those numbers are probably quite low compared to the actual number of people who might be questioning, right? Or may know but not feel comfortable, or ready to come out of the closet. Because again, that's a very personal decision. I think that one of the things that's always important when we're discussing this, and hopefully we have some great discussions around this topic, it's really important though to really think when you're talking to someone, and you may have a very different opinion, right? But just you never know who you're talking to. You could be talking to someone who themselves might be in the closet and afraid of what people might say to them. Or you may be talking to someone who's dealt with this throughout their life with a loved one, and which this is a touchy subject, right? And so that's where it's really important that we kind of remember that, everybody's a person, everybody has our own story, and we want to be, honest but respectful. I did this presentation last year at my community, and it was an awesome presentation, but I did have one resident who struggled with it, had a little bit of a differing opinion, which again is fine. But really struggled with it and actually walked out of the presentation. I was immediately mortified because I said, oh, geez, I've insulted someone for something, right? And so I was able to go and talk to them after finishing the presentation and really was able to find out that it wasn't that they were really offended, but it was that they had gone through personally, some family struggles surrounding this issue, and so it brought up quite a lot, right? And talking to them, I discovered that this person in their 90s, who was living on their own in our community, had a nephew who had come out as a gay individual years before, and hadn't talked to the family since. So after really talking with this person and sharing sort of my own personal feelings and very delicately sort of saying, listen, I'm here for you. I want to listen and I want to hear what you think, and letting them guide the process, because again, it's a personal process. It was really great to find out that after that discussion, this person had made the decision to actually reconnect with that family member, and has since talked to them and sort of tried to come together in a way that is, again, sort of showing that new understanding, but also realizing that wounds need time to heal, but giving them what they need to heal and starting that process, which I think was one of the most beautiful and impactful moments that I've ever had. And it's one of the reasons why I think talking about this subject is so important, just because regardless of our opinions of this subject, family members are just so important, right? Family is what we've got through this life, and to be able to really just put our differences aside and say, I might not agree with everything, I might not understand everything, right? But I can accept everything because family is so important, and I really want to make that, really want to make that point, right? So if we can take nothing else away from this, I just think that it's really important to look at life and say what is important to us, what really matters, right? Because that's what it's all about. So I just really want to thank everyone for sitting through this discussion, right, and sitting through this talk. And I really hope that we sort of were interested and learned something about the LGBTQ plus community and pride in general. I really think that this is an important topic for us to talk about. But I also think that, what pride really is that we're showing that, we're human beings, and that's a beautiful thing, right? We're alive on this planet, which is a miracle. And so let's celebrate that diversity, and let's celebrate what makes each of us unique. Everybody's got a story, right? Each and every one of you. And so let's share that, and let's make it a point to really, celebrate every single individual one of us. Even for the things that we may not understand, right? Can we accept them? Can we learn? So on the next slide, it is sort of a gateway to a question and answer where we can sort of talk to each other, see what you guys thought. Feel free to disagree with me. I won't be able to talk back, but that's okay. That's what we're looking for. So I hope that you guys can really have a great discussion, and feel free to contact me if you'd like to talk, because I'm always open to talking, as you can probably tell. But then, after that too, this slide does have a few resources if anyone's interested in sort of learning more about the community and the history, right? So, thank you guys very much, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Happy Pride Month.